We humans have shared the planet in varying degrees, as well as our lives with non-human animals for millennia. Today, 68% of all U.S. households, just over 82 million homes, include a companion animal, also known as pets. But what do we really think about man's best friend and his fellow creatures? Animal welfare and animal rights ahead on Wide Angle. Believing that their ancestors might take the form of non-human animals after reincarnation, followers of Eastern religions are understandably taught to treat animals with respect. Christianity and Judaism approach our relationship with animals differently. They teach that God gave humans dominion over the earth and every living thing upon it, and a philosophical tradition thereafter developed that offered a supporting logic. Animals, said Descartes, lack true speech and the ability to reason, and therefore do not warrant the same consideration or treatment as humans. It's little wonder, then, that many of we Americans inherited a conflicted relationship with non-human animals. How have we tried to understand that relationship, and how is it changing? Joining me today from his home in southern New Jersey to help explore such questions is DJ Schubert, a wildlife biologist at the Animal Welfare Institute. Prior to landing at the AAWI, he worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and the Fund for Animals. Welcome to Wide Angle, DJ.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for inviting me to be on Wide Angle.
A pleasure. Thanks for joining me. I just want to add to that introduction, DJ, if I can, a small bit of historical background, particularly for viewers. It involves Massachusetts as well. The idea of animal protection apparently entered the American colonial record back in 1641 in, of all places, Massachusetts. I gather it was in the General Court. It had a comprehensive legal code called the Body of Liberties, and sections 92 and 93 prohibited, and I quote, any tyranny or cruelty towards any brute creature, which are usually kept for man's use, and mandated periodic rest and refreshment for any cattle being driven or led. So the notion of a particular standard of care and treatment towards non-human animals on this continent is long-standing, and certainly goes back to before the nation was founded. 2 centuries later then, and this is where I'd like you to hop in with me if you would, mid-19th century, Societies for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, SPCAs, evolved alongside abolitionist as well as child protection movements. Yeah? So I'm wondering what was going on at this time that animal protection, child protection, abolition, the care of perhaps those more vulnerable with less of a voice in our society, if that plays into it. What was going on at that time that would lead to the creation of an animal protection movement in the U.S.?
Well, it's a fascinating subject, and I too remember reading about that 1641 legislation in Massachusetts, and was frankly that we could trace the animal protection movement, frankly, back to that period of time. In terms of the mid-19th century, as I understand it, you can add to the abolitionists, you can add to the child protection advocates, you know, the temperance movement, because apparently they felt that inebriates were harmful to not only their families, but to their horses. And so there was this sort of a collaboration, I guess you could call it, of these different movements where people that were concerned about children or animals or slavery or alcohol consumption came together to, frankly, promote a kinder society, a more benevolent society, a society where we didn't see animals necessarily as things to abuse or to use and throw away, but we provided them some level of respect, some level of kindness.
Right, right. And then we move not quite another century ahead, 1951, when your organization, Animal Welfare Institute, was founded. The mission, as I found it on the website, is to reduce animal suffering caused by people. We seek better treatment of animals everywhere, in the laboratory, on the farm, in commerce, at home, and in the wild. If you could, tell us a little bit about how Animal Welfare Institute goes about trying to achieve that mission, and maybe how it distinguishes itself from the SPCAs that preceded it.
Well, the Animal Welfare Institute is fairly small when you compare it to some of the other larger animal protection, wildlife conservation organizations in this country and worldwide. We have a staff of 20 to 30, if you include consultants, and we use all the various tools that are available to us: legislation, lobbying, public outreach, public education, litigation, etc., to advance our efforts to protect animals in the field, in the laboratory, on the farm. We have different departments that work. Some work on farm animal protection, others on wildlife, both domestic and international wildlife issues. We have a specialist on marine mammals in captivity. We have an entire marine mammal protection department. So we cover a large number of the issues that are commonly associated with animal protection, animal welfare, animal rights.
Sure, sure. And is there a distinction between AWI and SPCAs, or are they two types of organizations doing very similar work and adding to the voice of animals?
Well, I think there's overlap, I would say, between SPCAs and a group like the Animal Welfare Institute. We do have our distinct sort of corridors or paths. Many SPCAs have, for example, law enforcement authority. They can go and they can inspect complaints about abuse of dogs and horses and cats and things like that.
Sure.
You know, we don't have that type of law enforcement authority, but we do frequently work with the ASPCA and other SPCAs on common issues of concern, whether it be horse slaughter, or I can recall years ago working with an SPCA in Pennsylvania on live pigeon shoots. So oftentimes there are overlapping agenda items that we can work on collaboratively.
Sure, sure. Okay, so certainly one aspect of the conversation is to talk about animal protection and how we go about protecting animals and how organizations like yours do that. Another piece of it, and an equally interesting piece to me, is sort of what our conception of non-human animals is, because certainly how we conceive of them drives certainly our behavior of them and our relationships with them. So I wanted to drill a little deeper with you if you're game, as it were.
Sure.
Okay. We don't exactly see non-human animals as worthy of protections or treatment that, on the one hand, humans receive. Yeah, and yet neither do we think of them, I think, as a society certainly, as things that don't have feeling or we shouldn't give them consideration. Yeah, that they sort of reside in some place in between those two poles. So I'm wondering if, certainly given your work, how it is that we conceive of animals from a legal, from a political, or some other sense. Yeah?
Yeah, so I think society has evolved beyond thinking of animals as property, while our court system still considers, unfortunately, animals as property.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you look at least people I know and people I interact with, we no longer, most people no longer chain their dogs outside. The dogs are considered part of the family. You look at people that, a dog gets lost and they're heartbroken because they considered the dog a part of the family. It's not property. It's not, they don't treat it the way they would a child, but it is considered part of the family. It brings love into the family. It brings companionship into the family. I mean, many people still refer to dogs and cats as pets, but there's also a lot of people that see dogs and cats as companions. That's how my wife and I treat our animals, our cats, our dogs. They're our companions. We don't own them. We don't ever say to anyone, you know, this is the dog or the cat that I own, because they're our companions. They have certain inalienable rights, in our opinion, and we have a responsibility for their care. Yes, we do care for them. For the dogs, they go out. You know, we control when they go out and when they come back in.
Yeah.
And so they don't have the freedom that like a wolf would have, but we provide them with that protection that as companions we're responsible for. I think that you know, unfortunately, the courts, at least in this country and frankly in most countries, still treat animals as property.
Yeah.
You know, I'm seeing cases now and then where that's starting to change. But I think it's going to take a sea change in sort of legal mindset to completely reverse sort of decades or centuries of this attitude that animals were property.
Interesting. And I sort of sense, DJ, in that response, sort of laying out some of the different threads that are present in the animal protection movement itself. Yeah. As I understand it, there is a portion of the animal protection movement where it's animal welfare groups, like Animal Welfare Institute itself. And I'm not going to say on another side, but separate in some senses are animal rights groups. Yeah, and I'm wondering if you can sort of tease those apart a little bit for us in terms of what intersections and what overlaps the two types of groups have, and how they perceive animals and our relationships with them, and then what maybe distinct areas they sort of camp out.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and as I'm trained as a wildlife biologist, I can also add to that you know, for wildlife biologists, your sort of traditional wildlife manager or biologist, and many conservationists, when they look at wildlife populations, they see a population. When I look at wildlife populations as a person that is an animal rights activist by heart, but I work for an animal welfare institute, an animal welfare organization. Yeah. I see wildlife as individual animals. And so when you look at the link between animal welfare and animal rights, I think it's a philosophical difference, but they're both part of the same continuum. So philosophically, animal rights activists do not believe that we as humans have the rights to use animals. We shouldn't eat them. We shouldn't experiment on them. We shouldn't make them perform for our entertainment. Animal welfare activists often share similar views, but with animal welfare activists, the goal is not to necessarily immediately abolish certain unethical or unacceptable practices, but to improve the situation for the animals. Right. That's not to say that animal welfare activists accept all forms of animal exploitation. Certainly there are you know, bullfighting and cockfighting and things like that where animal rights activists and animal welfare activists sort of sing the same tune. Sure. But, you know, for example, with certain types of experimentation on animals, animal welfare activists would take the position that let's try to reduce the number of animals used in those experiments. Let's try to improve their living conditions in the laboratory. Let's try to make sure the experiments that are done on them are done as humanely as possible. Animal rights activists, on the other hand, want to abolish those experiments. But, you know, personally, I see animal welfare activism as a stepping stone to achieve what animal rights activists and what that philosophy you know, calls for, which is to end sort of human use, human exploitation of animals. Right.
Probably one place where animal welfare groups and animal rights groups would diverge is on the notion of personhood. Yeah. I'm gonna guess that that's the case, but I'll introduce to viewers the work of Stephen Wise, who is a lawyer and founder of the Non-Human Rights Project. He and his colleagues believe that chimpanzees, and I gather a small group of other animals, should be treated as persons. And simply for viewers listening to that sentence, chimpanzees perceived as legal persons, it may come off sounding a little bit odd. But in fact, in the same way that corporations following Citizens United ruling in 2010 are considered legal persons, I gather in the days of brigantines and clipper ships, ocean-going vessels were considered legal persons as well. And persons is to be distinguished from human. They're not used synonymously. Human is what we are, and persons is really a legal definition, yeah, so that, as you say, courts can have conversations about different beings, yeah?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I think the work that, I mean, from my perspective, and I actually consulted some colleagues about this, animal rights advocates and animal welfare advocates are, I think, equally supportive of what Mr. Wise is doing.
Really?
And the efforts that he's making to try to establish a body of law that says that chimpanzees, orangutans, and other species, including elephants, whales, and dolphins, which are part of his portfolio, that they have certain rights. You know, when you read articles about the work of Stephen Wise, you often see detractors saying, "Oh, what does he want them to be able to vote and drive cars and things like that?" And that's just people that are sort of fearful of what might come from what Stephen Wise is doing. That's their reaction. I think that's just preposterous. That's not what Stephen Wise is trying to do.
Right.
We're simply, or what he's trying to do is simply establish the fact that these animals that have these immense cognitive abilities should be given certain rights that they don't currently enjoy. They shouldn't be locked up in cages. We shouldn't be allowed to experiment on them. I mean, if you look at chimpanzees and you understand how closely related we are to chimpanzees genetically, it's just astonishing how we have treated that species in the past. And yes, things are changing and things are better. But you know, I've worked undercover in a laboratory where there were chimpanzees being kept in just these sterile, tiny cages, and it was just so heartbreaking and so difficult to comprehend how we as humans, or people that support this type of exploitation, how they think that's acceptable. Because I can't fathom why anyone would consider that type of treatment of that species, and frankly of any species, acceptable.
Let's take a quick break there, DJ, and invite viewers to join us on the other side, where we'll discuss animal welfare around the world, as well as our own evolving treatment of non-human animals.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Email us at wideangle@acmi.tv. For information about this episode or to view other Wide Angle episodes, visit us online at acmi.tv/wideangle.
Welcome back to Wide Angle. I'm Peter Bermuda, speaking today with Animal Welfare Institute biologist DJ Schubert about animal welfare and animal rights. So let's broaden sort of our perspective, if we can, a little bit, DJ, and look beyond our own country's borders. You have some sense, I gather you traveled earlier in your life as part of Peace Corps. Certainly, I would imagine your work brings at least your gaze to other countries around the world. A sense of how other countries, how other people are conceiving of animals and also, therefore, treating them.
Well, I'm very fortunate in that I was able to serve as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer right after college. And since I've been employed by the Animal Welfare Institute, since I work on international wildlife trade issues and on whale conservation issues, I've been very fortunate to be able to travel to many parts of the world to participate in meetings. And I do think that I guess there's a positive and negative to that. The positive I see after decades working in the animal protection movement is we have made progress around the world on some animal issues. The negative is at the moment, at least, international wildlife issues are not going the right direction. International wildlife trade is out of control. The exploitation of wild animals in various nations, Africa, continents, Africa, South America, Asia, it's out of control. Yeah. So domestic use is driving a lot of species towards extinction. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing a easy solution to that. However, I would note that there's more and more organizations, there are more and more people, there are more and more governments paying attention to not only wildlife conservation issues, but cruelty issues in general. Guatemala just a couple months ago promulgated new animal protection laws that I understand are quite progressive.
Right. I would imagine, DJ, that certainly there are a number of viewers who are interested in this topic, and so on behalf of them, I'll ask if there are resources that you think would be worthy for people to check out, be they books or websites or organizations to follow up more.
Yeah, that's a very it's a very good question, and it's a very interesting question because there's such a vast amount of information out there. It's hard to really pinpoint where people should go. I think the key is, there are some books that I think are the sort of seminal books for animal welfare, animal rights activists. Certainly 1975, Peter Singer published Animal Liberation. 1983, Tom Reagan published The Case for Animal Rights. And then 2000, Stephen Wise, who you mentioned earlier, published Rattling the Cage. If I was a beginner, I might start with those three just to get an idea of the different philosophies. And then I would certainly encourage your viewers to consider attending animal rights conferences. There are typically a couple conferences each year, and that's a good place to get introduced to the wide variety of subjects that animal rights and animal welfare activists work on. And then if they have specific interests in, gorillas or elephants or, snakes, frogs, amphibians, dolphins, whatever it may be, the internet's a massive tool. Not that everything on the internet is always true, as we know, but you can certainly learn a lot by Googling that particular species and really digging into it. There are a vast number of organizations here in the U.S. and around the world that have either species-specific programs or even more holistic programs that look at, ecosystems. And I would encourage your viewers to find the organization that might have the philosophy that best matches their own and to support them. And I would encourage people not just to look at the big organizations. Oftentimes they get the bulk of the attention, but there's an awful lot of small organizations in this country and around the world that are just doing amazing work to try to protect wildlife, and they need all the support they can get.
Right. Just as a last question, DJ, anything that we haven't spoken of today that you feel would be good for viewers to go away from this conversation with?
Well, I would say that just going back to the initial part of our conversation about sort of this historical perspective, there was a quote made by a philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, and from my early days in the animal rights movement, when I worked at People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, this quote has always stuck with me because I think it really encapsulates the issue that I think we all should be aware of as we live our daily lives and we interact with animals. And that quote was from 1789, and it was the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And I think the question about can they suffer is critical. I think everyone, just about everyone, understands that any living creature, from a ant to a elephant, can suffer. And the question is, how do we live our lives in such a way that we reduce the suffering that we cause to other living creatures.
Yeah. Well, DJ, I thank you so much for taking the time, certainly, to join me today. And I thank you for your decades of work and for the spirit that you give it up to other people, certainly the way we were talking over issues today.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's been as frustrating as it can be working in the animal protection movement. It's something that I'm absolutely passionate about, and I appreciate people like you, the media in general, that allow me and my colleagues from around the world to tell our stories.
As if it were yesterday, I remember a friend of mine sharing a snippet of her childhood on the family farm in upstate New York. Amongst other animals, they raised cows, and she recalled a particular calf who arrived one spring. Against her father's advice, she named the calf and enjoyed that animal as only a child can. But predictably, the calf grew into a cow, and the conclusion of this tale you can likely surmise. For me, the takeaway was simple. We only love those things we come to know. But the additional lesson, I think, is this. It is only those things and beings that we love that we'll work to save. And as we grow increasingly urbanized and isolated from the natural world, it becomes dangerously easy for us to accept the loss of animals with whom we've never become familiar. For this, we would be a lonelier species, for sure, biologically, socially, and, I fear, spiritually. There is some promising news, however. A 2015 Gallup poll found that a third of Americans believe animals and humans should have the same rights. Regardless of the particulars here, this, to my mind, heads us in the right direction, a step away from mass extinctions and toward a relationship of, if not equals, at least beings worthy of consideration and mutual respect. On behalf of DJ Schubert of the Animal Welfare Institute, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.